Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the dead zones for Bluey. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But to get into it, what we have here is a 28.5%, what I've been calling a bloated square dead zone. This type of dead zone is created by having an underlying radial dead zone and then using the scaled input from that and applying an axial dead zone on top of it. And that sort of bloats the otherwise straight thresholds of the axial dead zone. But the axial portion of the dead zone limits diagonal movement around the axes. So if I move the stick anywhere within these blue regions, you can see that I'm moving in one of four directions, in this case perfectly right and perfectly forward. You only start seeing diagonal movement once you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by this green region. And the angle transitions are pretty noticeable because it seems like the input hasn't been scaled around this axial dead zone, so subtle angles are actually lost. And we can see this more clearly when capping the movement like this and looking for horizontal movement. Whereas you see that diagonal movement starts pretty abruptly, and it happens more abruptly the closer to the dead zone we are. And if we move away from this, we can see how strong of an angle we get when just passing this threshold. And that's because within the axial dead zone, your input's being zeroed out, but when you exit it, you're moving at the correct angle that you're moving at. So if I move here, I'm moving at a very strong angle, but then all these angles are lost within the axial dead zone. At the very edges of the stick movement within these axial regions, the restriction flares out, and it seems like they're applying an angular restriction method on top of this axial dead zone, and that's also unscaled. So you're losing a similar amount of your angular movement to the general axial dead zone. But otherwise, for the movement speeds, there are two available: your walk speed and your run speed. Walking is just over 50% of your total speed. And the threshold for this is sort of a slight gear shape. Within the axial dead zones, this threshold looks pretty straight, but it's actually slightly curved. It's warped, similar to the inner dead zone around this underlying radial threshold, but since it's so much farther out, it looks quite a bit straighter. But when you move into the diagonal regions, it's perfectly circular. And this is, of course, the result of not scaling the input around the axial dead zone. So within this region, you have perfectly zeroed input. In this case, the horizontal movement is zeroed out, but then you exit the dead zone, axial dead zone, and then you get your original correct angular input and then a perfect radial threshold because of that. If this were scaled around the axial dead zone, you would have a smooth connection here, but likely a more squarish shape, since the axial dead zone would offset the radial thresholds a bit. But since it's unscaled, you actually see the radial threshold perfectly here. but there is a sharp division right at this axis line where there's a little step that creates that kind of cog shape in the overall gear shape of this. But you've probably seen what this dash threshold does throughout this demonstration. But this dash threshold controls the character facing, so this doesn't control the character's movement or their direction. It's just a visual thing. And all the characters have 5 facings, so the forward towards the camera facing is within this wedge. And when you break through this threshold, it flips to the forward 3/4 view, and that's reserved for this large section. And this makes sense because most sort of puppet animation has both the horizontal and forward movements share the same facing. But when we move to the back facing, this region right here is dedicated to backwards left 3/4, and then the rest of the back range is dedicated to the right backwards 3/4. If we added some extra dash lines to divide these larger sections in two, we would actually have the thresholds for a perfect 8 divisions on the stick. But since these forward movements are shared and there is no dedicated perfect backward movement, every character just has 5 directions they can face. But what's sort of interesting here, and what was applied to the restriction, is that this really shows that they are using angular thresholds for these divisions. So there was really no reason to use an axial deadzone here. They are using an angular restriction method, which is unscaled, but without this axial deadzone, this actually restricts more diagonal movement right around the deadzone than just an axial restriction method would by itself. So there's unnecessary levels of restriction here. But of course, this is a very simple game. It's designed for young children, so the precision you need doesn't really, this implementation doesn't really affect that. But it would be, of course, ideal to scale the input so that any angles aren't lost when passing through these thresholds, that you have a smooth gradient from your perfectly profiled movement to very subtle angles. But otherwise, that covers things. So for the type of game that this is, the unscaled nature of it doesn't really affect things, but there are always more ideal ways to do it, even if you don't actually need the precision for the type of game that you're implementing it for. But that covers things, so thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.